Sorry, this is a little hard on you going from one person to another like that, but I also have been thinking like Toril about what the experience of making pictures has been with my collaborators. And I wanted to start off by reading two little pieces. One is something that a girl in South Africa, Palisa, said when she was 12 about the work that she did with me. She said, "Pictures are worthwhile to remember something. It's the important thing about them, to remember something about the past, but not the horrible past, the nice past, nice things you had once. I keep my pictures in an album in my mother's drawer. I look at them sometimes when there's nothing I'm doing. I try to remember how it was when I took the picture. I think of the pictures rewinding and going back like a cassette, all those things happening over again." And then I want to read a bit from a recent letter I got from Willie Whitaker, who was one of my students in Kentucky 30 years ago. And he was 13 when we worked together, and now he's 43. And he said in his letter, "Since leaving Kentucky, life certainly took on a much quicker pace. And since I passed 40, it appears as if it's moving like a fast-forward button on a VCR. Way too fast, and appears there's no way to slow it down. Now 2/3 of my work career is nearly over. I have a much worn copy of the book we made and show it quite often. There's the photo of my now deceased father and his mule Kate, him pulling back on the reins, me asking to stop and let me take his picture after a hard day's work plowing the fields. The one of my niece with her .22 rifle, who now teaches school and has a child about the same age she was when I snapped that photo. One of a simple white chicken near the corn crib. While just out of view was my mother holding a pail of fresh milk. Funny how one can remember the location of photos, even after making hundreds and many years after taking them, the smells, weather, the laughter or sadness that filled the air." So I wanted to talk a bit about my process and how I came to work in the collaborative way that I do and how I see it. And I also want to start with my son, Michael, a few years ago, who was tested to determine whether he should be placed in a pre-kindergarten or a kindergarten. And he was asked to make a drawing of a man, and he included his heart and soul. And the testers had never seen a 4-year-old make such an unusual drawing of a human being. And despite my protest, because I was worried that Michael would be too young in his class, he was placed in a kindergarten rather than a pre-kindergarten class. And there are 10 kindergartens in his large school, and outside each classroom, the teachers had mounted cutouts of various things like apples, stars, animals, with the name of each child written inside the cutouts, so the new kindergartners could find their rooms. And each class had a unique symbol, and my son's was an owl, but a brown owl, and their names were written in black marker inside. So for 5-year-olds just learning how to read or pick out letters, it was very difficult to read. And inside the classroom, the teacher had done the same thing with little owls over the places where they were supposed to hang their coats with their names. So she'd obviously made an effort, but to these kids who are already versed in the visual rhetoric of our society, it must have seemed misguided and incoherent. And it was a nice try, but it didn't work. And I think this is only one of the first steps in creating borders between childhood and the adult world. And we're always hearing about the fact that we live in a visual culture, and we're being warned about the negative effects of the visual culture on our children. But for some reason, we refuse to think about how they see things. And once their nursery days are over, very rarely do people pay attention to the visual environments that children are living in. And art enrichment classes are not much help because they rarely approach the sophistication that kids have inside them and in the culture around them. So my art has sort of grown out of 35 years of trying to pay attention to our visual surroundings and our need as human beings to articulate and communicate something relevant about our lives, as well as looking for some of the boundaries that separate us by age, race, language, education, and sometimes class. So my process has evolved gradually, thinking about how we learn and about images and the barriers that are created from childhood by our institutions. And my work as an artist, I see as being intertwined with my work as a teacher. And I often say it's sort of that I think I disguise myself as a teacher in order to make the pictures that I want to see. And it's kind of my game, or my game and my collaborators, to see the world through their perceptions as well as my own, and to make my work theirs and their work mine. But early on, it became clear to me that my students' work, whatever its educational merit was, and that's a big topic, was something more than mimicry of mass media imagery. And the pictures they took were very different from the photography of children that characterizes a lot of projects that have good intentions, but we know the familiar portrayals of kids as victims of poverty, war, or safe, adorable children in middle-class tableaus. These sorts of images, I think, confirm packaged ideas about innocence, because innocence is such a treasured condition. We welcome assurances that children are somehow developmentally predictable, and that at any given time that they can't know certain essential experiences. But for better or worse, the often very menacing images my students produce do not bolster this assurance. But I don't think that either they or I or us together are doing lessons or reportage, but a kind of collaborative artistry in which I hope the images draw their force directly from cultural tensions. And to categorize this as children's art, I think shortchanges it and shortchanges the subtleties of it. And maybe it's not much help to cite Boyce and say that everyone is an artist, but simply to agree that this kind of work is as mysterious as any kind of art. I first started taking pictures when I was 17, when my grandmother gave me a brownie. When I was 11. And earlier that year, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of my younger brothers was hit by a car and suffered brain damage. And in the course of playing with him in the hospital, I developed a game because he had to learn how to talk and walk. And I was interested in helping him acquire his language back. So I devised a wheelchair game of stop and go using handmade drawings that I had made. And that was the first step in helping him regain his speech. And when I look back at it, I think that that's maybe where I first understood the power of images to teach. And then I started making photographs of my brothers and sisters when I was 17 with a 4x5. But working with my brother was I think the start of my lifelong interest in children. And then I started working in 1969 on an Indian reservation in Canada, and I remembered how excited I was to take pictures. So I wanted to see what kinds of pictures that the children I was going to work with would take. So I got Polaroid cameras and film. And as soon as I saw their pictures, I knew they had a power I hadn't seen in photographs before. And that led me to wonder if I could consciously merge the subject of the picture and the photographer and create a new way of working. So I knew, of course, that there are risks in guiding children and non-photographers towards artistic expression, including the risk of challenging an adult vision. And it was many years before anyone, I think, understood what I was up to. But during that time, I started to wonder how different were the two kinds of photography, mine and theirs. And clearly there was a radical difference between interrogation by the camera and response by the subject. And this led me to think about that in working with others, I had to learn as much as was possible how to see what they were seeing and what kinds of questions their vision asked of the world. And these questions were what has really kept me going in all this time. It's sort of like learning a new language each time I begin a new project. And each child and each culture seems to have a different sense of composition, determined maybe by the landscape and the interiors of the homes. And it's very difficult many times because I feel like I can't see actually what's going on until possibly one image or a suite of images will unlock the visual culture that I'm living in the midst of. And I think about in South Africa, one photograph, sort of formal photograph of two grandmothers shaking hands allowed me to start creating a context for the images in my own mind. And gradually I saw it was less interesting for me as an artist to frame the world wholly according to my perceptions, and I wanted instead to create situations in which I could allow others' perceptions to surface with my own. So I'm going to kind of start with the last project I did in Margate, which this image is from. And I want to read what one of the kids that I worked with said as a way to sort of start it. In this short world of 2 days, why do you walk so proudly? Even if you become a Suleiman, in the end you will still die. I wish for the rights of all children of the world to be respected. I hope for a bright future for all the children in the world. My name is Ali Reza. I was born in Afghanistan, Ghazni. Because of the problems in Afghanistan, I could not continue my life there. I wanted to get away from all the pain I had suffered to live in a free country. So this project is called Towards the Promised Land, and which I did in Margate, and that's where I met Ali Reza. And as many of you know, Margate is a kind of down at the heels seaside resort at this point, but with many grand old buildings that are now, some of them boarded up. But many years ago, the Home Office began using some of the hotels as housing for hundreds of families who left their homes and came to England as asylum seekers. And right now, there's many from Africa, but they've come from all over Afghanistan, Iraq, Congo, Angola, Sudan. And so for several weeks during the winter and spring before last, I worked with children from these asylum-seeking families, making portraits of them, as you can see here, and teaching them how to make photographs. But some of them were asylum seekers living in one of the hotels, but also some of them were British migrants, refugees from domestic troubles. And some of the children had migrated with their families, and others, like Reza, came on their own. And they all made photographs of their new homes, whether that was one room in the case of the families who were living in the hotel, or in a larger context. They also made maps of the places they'd come from, maps of their journeys, maps of the new places they lived. So in addition to making portraits of them, I photographed the backs of the heads, and together we made still lives of the objects they brought with them. And then months later, when they all spoke English, They wrote phrases from the interviews that we had initially made as soon as they arrived in Margate. So in this case, it says on the back of her head, so my mind can go away from a dream. I think of a blackboard with nothing on it. And then underneath her face is the date of the interview in Afrikaans, her first language. And I hoped, so first of all, we put these up on the chalk cliffs, as you can see here, looking out on the channel. And 9 months later, we hung up more banners in and around Dreamland. So some of them have now been up for almost a year and a half. And Dreamland was the old abandoned amusement park. And I hope that by making visible the children who normally are invisible in this context, and by including British migrants as well as asylum seekers in this installation, that I could humanize the asylum seekers, such as Ali Reza, and provoke a discussion about the universality of migration. It took us 10 days to hang the first suite of banners. We had all kinds of problems. And some of them, this is one of the first we put up. And on the 8th day of the installation is when the bombs went off in London. And 2 days later, the exhibition opened. 5 days after that, the back of her head and the front of her head were petrobombed by unknown persons. And they were almost totally destroyed. And the image in the middle, which is Zakia's flip-flops and 2 or 3 copies of the Principles of Islam, along with little flags from South Africa in the top. She arranged that still life. That was left intact, which I thought was very, very clever. Eventually, 9 months later, we replaced them at the request of the family. We thought we'd give it some time and put them up while we put the other ones up. And then 10 days later, Zakia's face was burned again. And we've just put it up again. And as far as I know, it's still there. So it's different for me, this kind of public project. Okay, next slide. This is Ali Reza, and he says, "I am mourning that I don't have my mother with me and her protecting shadow around my head." And then it's a picture of, in the center, of a scarf that his mother embroidered, and the phone that he uses to call Afghanistan, as well as the keys to his room. And I think the one in the back of his head, it says, "They killed my father. I think they will kill me. That's what an enemy is." This is Ashley, and she came from Dartford to Margate when her mother died. And I think she's written the things that she's brought with her. I can't quite read it from here. This is the second wave that we put in through town. So as you come off the train station, you can and you walk down the beach, they're very evident. It's kind of like the town is peopled with these kids. And Yuri is on the Dreamland Tower, and it's printed on vinyl, and I think it's by about 5 meters by 6 meters. And it says, "It happened that we had to leave my lovely country." And then you can see Gareth, who's under Dreamland Welcomes You. And he says, my dad wanted to leave, there was windy bricking all sorts. And And Gareth came from Belfast after they were threatened there, and Yuri came from Belarus and has been deported, I think. And this is another one of Yuri. This is Celeste, and Celeste came from Congo, and she set up her clothes to have me photograph because that's what she brought with her. And for the kids who the asylum-seeking kids, often the things that we photographed together were very everyday objects, just the things that they absolutely needed, whereas the kids from Britain, they were objects that were more sentimental. And I think Celeste says on her, I didn't like English, it gave me a headache. This is Rabi, and who's Celeste's sister, and she's obviously also from the Congo. And she asked me to photograph the Bible, and we set it up on the beach and then used pieces of chalk to keep it open. And the text on there refers to when they came into her school and set off bombs. And both Celeste and Robbie have disappeared. And none of the asylum seekers that I worked with have gotten asylum, and it's been over 2 years since we worked together, since they first came. And this is Glenn. He says, sometimes exciting things worry you and make you winkly in the knees. And he was from, I don't remember, somewhere in Britain. And he and his sister were both being bullied in school. So their parents decided to make a change and move to Margate. Christian, and he's also from the Congo. And it says, me, no, it's not me, Christian in Europe, over his face. And on the back of his head, it says, my favorite program is the news, because that way, if something bad happens, I can tell the others. And Christian now is living in Glasgow and speaking English, and is a very sophisticated young man. And he says about this picture now, these pictures now, is that's when I was cold and scared. This is Mariam, from a Coptic Christian girl from Egypt. And on the back of her head, it says, the first thing I saw was a flock of pigeons. And then her object is a Christian Dior bag from Alexandria that she brought her keepsakes in. I just saw her, as I just saw Christiane, and she and her family just lost their last appeal and were put in a detention center and then miraculously released. And now we're awaiting to see what's going to happen to them. But she said, we've been waiting so long, it doesn't matter anymore. Now, to go backwards to Kentucky, where I worked from 1975 to 1982. This is a picture taken by Janet Stallard, and it's a self-portrait, and it's called, I Took a Picture of Myself with the Statue in the Backyard. This is by Ruby Cornett, and it's called, I Asked My Sister to Take a Picture of Me on Easter Morning. I worked in 3 schools, a one-room school with 8 grades, and then 2 small consolidated schools, so I was able to work with all of the kids. And the first thing that I asked them to do was to make self-portraits, largely because they were as interested in being in photographs as they were taking them. This is called Self-Portrait with a picture of my biggest brother Everett, who killed himself when he came back from Vietnam, and by Freddie Childers. And the picture of Everett, Everett was 6, as was Freddie when he made this picture. So presumably, this is a Polaroid, presumably he worked with his, asked his, one of his older siblings to make the picture, but the deal was that he had to look through the camera and set it up, and then could change places with the photographer. So the next thing I asked them to do was to photograph their parents. And this is by Martha Campbell, and it's called Mommy and Daddy. And I began to notice, I mean, all kinds of things, obviously, about these pictures, but the details, like the cup on the back of the chair, are so meaningful. And these were taken with Instamatic cameras, which they don't make anymore, but they were a perfect tool. This is called My Daddy is Measuring Our Hog, by Joy Ingram. And the hog is getting measured for the big day ahead. Animals were very important to these kids, so that was another thing that we consciously worked on. This is one of the dream pictures, and I came to thinking about the idea of dreams or fantasies with kids as I'm the oldest of 6 kids, so I watch my brothers and sisters play a lot. But I also noticed my neighbors' kids playing in the mountains and with the animals, because it was a very rural area and the kids had a lot of freedom. And so I began thinking about how I could access that photographically. And the idea of talking about dreams was something sort of concrete and literal, a good place to start. So we had built a darkroom inside the classroom. So first time I did this, we all got into the darkroom and started telling our dreams. And at first people were a little reticent, the kids were a little reticent, but then they really got into it. Because I wanted to create a comfortable environment for this. And then I asked them to go home and make some of those pictures. And I was amazed by what came back, and that sort of set me on a path to look at that in different places where I've worked. This one is called I Dreamt I Killed My Best Friend, Ricky Dixon, by Alan Shepard. And Alan and oops, can we go back? Alan and Ricky had an argument. They both had hunting knives, as kids do there, and they decided to swap knives. And each one thought the other one had tricked him, and so they'd stopped talking. So Alan had this dream, and then asked Ricky to enact it for him. And in the making of the picture, the 2 boys actually made up. This is by Denise Dixon. She's probably the most talented kid I've ever worked with. And she had only 2 subjects, herself and her twin brothers. And I worked with her for 4 years, as I did many of these kids, worked with them for a long time. So I saw them change and come to puberty. And this one is called I Am Dolly Parton, who's a country western singer, for those of you who don't know. And how's the next one? And this one is her and it's called I Am the Girl with the Snake Around Her Neck. And Denise made many pictures of herself and as this seductive young girl. And I always like to say that Denise started making these kinds of pictures before Cindy Sherman did, if you know her work. Next one. This is also by Denise. And it's the twin brothers, and it's called Philip and Jamie Are Creatures from Outer Space in Their Spaceship. And I like the fact that creatures from outer space read the newspaper. But Denise worked really hard to get the effects that she got. So the stockings that are over their faces, it's not just sort of a one-off idea. You can see from her contact sheets that she experimented with a lot of different materials until she got it right. And she made a lot of longer dream images that are very, very complex. And we had an exhibition, we had several. I mean, they had an exhibition at the International Center of Photography in New York, and they had one in Chicago. But the first one we had was at, and this was all while we were working together, was at the University of Kentucky. And so we could bring a lot of the kids and their parents. And Denise's mother was always very supportive of Denise's photography. So she came. But she stood next to this image the whole opening to tell everybody who looked at it that her children really didn't look that way. So then I continued. I sort of got this idea, well, then maybe I could go other places and look at situations in this way. So I next went to Colombia and spent 2 years there, and then went to India. Which is as a photographer, was a fascinating place for me to be. I lived in this village, and I worked with 20 kids. Sajan is one of them. And I quickly came to understand that they didn't know what photographs were. So it allowed me to really rethink my own ideas about photography, but also what it really meant. As I said, the kids didn't know what photographs were when I began. So the first thing I did was to make portraits of each of them because they had never had them before, and with positive negative film, so they could see what the camera did, what the negative did, and what a positive was. And there were actually some of the kids who thought that if you held a camera and you imagined something, that's what would come out on the negative. So this is another one of my students, Hasmukh, and I later realized that these pictures had a kind of power to them because it was the first time that they were looking back at a camera. So they just sat down however they wanted to sit down. And later when I went to make a book of it, I realized that I really needed the kids' stories, and so I became quite involved with text. But I just wanted to read you a little tiny thing or a little bit of what Hasmukh, this boy, said. I got married 2 months ago. It was a nice day. We all went to my wife's village on a tractor. No one danced, but people sang. I enjoyed it. Once we got married, my wife went back to her village. She came back here twice to stay. When she came for a Diwali holiday, I was sitting outside. I was ready for her, wearing new pants and shirt. I have 3 safari suits for fancy dress. She stayed for 15 days, so I had to dress nicely all that time. I don't have any brothers and sisters at home, so I like it when she comes to stay. I have 3 sisters, but they are all married. One brother died in an accident and one drowned. He was a lame fellow. Neither of his legs worked. When he walked to the fields on crutches, he always passed a dump. One day it was filled with water, and he fell into it and drowned. I dream about my brothers that died, so at night I cover myself with a blanket to keep away the dreams. When my heart beats, the dream comes out. It shouts from the whole body, I'm coming out. and then it comes out. On Diwali, I dreamed that I went up to the sun in a balloon. I saw 2 goats standing on the edge of the sun, and they tried to butt me away. We are all dreaming, but in the morning when we open our eyes, the dreams are all gone. Last night, I dreamed I had a girl in my pocket. So then I wrote the story of how we worked together, and the kids actually, first of all, wanted to photograph the gods, and this was what they had in mind. And this is a collage that one of them made, and we actually built a building for a darkroom, and so I think that's a prayer. On the other side is a prayer that was recited at the opening of the darkroom. But the kids used everything they could, every bit of the photographic process to make something out of. So they used old photographs that they had rejected from one reason or another to make these collages, but they also used the film boxes, the film leader, anything that related to it. And eventually, when I made this book, I included my photographs in it. There's a chapter of my photographs and a chapter of the kids' photographs. And on the left is a photograph taken by Sajjan, and the little boy in the center is marrying the girl whose face is cut off in the front. And on the other side is a photograph I made of one of my neighbors. Then I was really continuing to travel, and Polaroid asked me to go to Mexico in 1991 because they wanted to commemorate the arrival of Columbus in America, and nobody had told them that. It was a politically incorrect idea. But I took their money anyway and went. And also, I ended up going to Chiapas, and this was a year before the uprising there. I worked with 2 groups of Mayan children and 2 groups of Ladino or children who are descendants of Indians and Spanish people. And this is a photograph by Juan Jesus Murillo, and it's called "Here is My Cousin Miri with the Skulls and Fruit for the Day of the Dead." This is by Teresa Lopez, and it's called "My Dog Walking in the Patio." This is "My Sister is Braiding Her Hair" by Nicasio Perez. And this is by Vladimir Stalin Becerril Vargas, and it's called "The Hens Are Going into the Kitchen." And this is "My Sister Carrying the Water" by Luis Hernandez Gomez. This is one of my favorite pictures, and it's by Sebastian Gomez Hernandez, and it's called "The Devil is Spying on the Girls." And with all of these pictures, I wasn't there when they were being made, so I had no idea how this kid got up in the tree. But in Mayan culture, and this is by one of the Mayan students, dreams are as important as waking reality. And so when I mentioned the fact that we were going to be taking pictures of fantasias the next day, they got very excited. And some of the kids made masks from the backs of cracker boxes, or because they didn't have any materials to make things with. But they made these beautiful, really beautiful masks. And when I asked him why the devil had horns coming from his jaw instead of the top of his head, he said, "I don't know, it just looks good that way." But then later, an anthropologist I was sharing a house with showed me pictures of the Mayan glyphs that had those same shapes coming from the jaws, and which led me to start thinking more about, all these images, they come from somewhere. They're not accidental. I mean, not only that the kids are constructing things, but also that they're these they have a cultural memory, which was very important. And this one is called Wolfman and His Enemy by Javier Bautista. And these cameras are very complicated to use, ProPack cameras with positive negative film. And I didn't think it was something actually that they were going to be able to do, because they had to set the distance between themselves and the subject. You can't see. They had to carry a bucket of sodium sulfite. And some of the kids, even their hands weren't big enough to really grip the shutter. But it didn't seem to matter. They worked very hard to learn the technology, and then once they went out, they were very meticulous. This is a particularly frightening one too, called Sebastián Was Punished for 8 Hours, by Dominga González Castellanos. And it's amazing. I mean, she could have gotten this idea across by just putting a couple of turns of the rope around him, but they really went to great lengths to produce very realistic photographs. And this one probably scares kids more than any of the other ones. So I continued for a while making my own pictures and then working as a teacher. And then I started really thinking about the idea of that really I was an artist in both situations, and I was a teacher in both situations. And that's what interested me. And rather than thinking about them as two different strands, to try to think of them as my work and as their work. And so I started making pictures where I would make the pictures, but then they would, together we would plan them, and then they would write on them, which is obviously what the Margate piece is as well. And also, I had started a program in the Durham, North Carolina school system, where I was training teachers, and teachers were using photography on a pretty big scale. So I was interested in the educational system and using the educational system as a basis for my artwork. And I thought about the alphabet being the literal font of our language, and how that's really where we start in school. So I did a series of alphabet projects, and this is the result of one of them that I did with a school in Queens, New York, with Arabic-speaking students, and it's the Arabic alphabet, and they're printed on a sort of see-through silk. And it's an installation in the Queens Museum. So this is Amar, which means to command, which is for the letter Aleph. So the kids, they sort of divided up the alphabet, and then they picked the words that they wanted to represent, and then we made a studio, in this case outside on the sidewalk, and then used different backdrops and lights and to make the images, and then they drew with different color Sharpies on the negative. This is Jim, or neighbor. This is Sham, or smell. And this is diminish, which is also one of my favorite ones. It's a very sort of unchildlike word to pick. But one of the things, when I started doing this, I did it in Spanish, and I did it with African American students in Cleveland, with white girls in Massachusetts, and then the Arabic alphabet. And what I started realizing is that the words that the kids picked were a kind of cultural self-portrait. This is kitab, or book. And it's very complicated, to figure out how the colors were going to come out in the negatives. So we did lots of tests, and they really enjoyed that. They were very professional about working on the project. This is lunch, the school lunch. And another installation view. This actually opened the weekend of the invasion of Iraq, and we had a special Arab family day, and we were all standing underneath the banners and speaking, and it was very moving because people were talking about their feelings about being Arabs and being Americans, and about what it meant to them to see their language portrayed in this way. And we're just about to have another get-together now, years later. Okay, this is a final project called Black Self, White Self that I did in Durham, North Carolina. Again, when I was working on these educational-based projects. And there were two school systems at the time in the town, or in the city. One was almost entirely African American, and the other was predominantly white. And they were about to be merged into one system. And I was working in both, and the kids were very nervous, particularly the African American kids, about what this change was going to be. And so I started thinking about how I could photographically address it. And then so I thought about the idea of black and white and photography and negative and positive. And I started out by asking them to write a self-portrait, as I do a lot, and then to write another self-portrait as if they were a member of the other race. And so you can see here, this is Damian Barnett, and he's an African-American young man. He's saying, I'm light-skinned and black, and I have black hair. I'm about 4-something. My name is Damien. I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers. And as a white boy, he's 11 years old, and his name is Brett, and he's an only child. And it's a very complicated, but you get it's almost kind of a shorthand in seeing how these kids saw race, saw themselves reflected by the culture as well. And then I asked them to bring props from home to pose as each of their selves. And this is Damien again. And so you can see as a white boy, he's chosen these white pants and this kind of shirt to wear and the pose he's making. And he loves money, and he's an only child. And then the other one is him as himself, and he loves to dance and has a big family. This is Antonio Gunter, and he posed quite deliberately as his white self as a homeless boy. And I was really intrigued by that and asked him what it meant or why he chose to do that. And he said that he imagined being white would be to not have the kind and warmth, the kind of community, the warm community that he had as an African American boy. And this is Heather Rose, and she's portraying herself as a reader and her black self as a jump roper. And one thing, when I did this initially, all of the depictions of someone reading were in the white selves. And this eventually changed because I did it for a while, and lots of other people started doing it as well in Durham. And so as the two school systems merged, I think that this perception changed. This is Gregory Blake, an African-American boy, imagining to be white as being obviously very aggressive, but he drew these beautiful lines. I mean, actually, he's painted them on the negative with an opaque ink, and then scratched his trousers. And this is Xavier Vereen, and I think I can just read you very quickly. He says about himself, "I am 1, silly, 2, have dark brown hair, 3, I'm scared of snakes, 4, I like dancing and singing, 5, I like to swim, 6, I like track and field, 7, I like to talk on the phone, 8, I like to play with my dog, 9, my favorite team is North Carolina, 10, my favorite food is pizza." And then he says, "If I was white, 1, I will change my name to Jonathan on Family Matters," which is a show, I don't know. 2, people will call me a saltine. 3, I will be a rock star on stage. 4, I will stay in school. 5, going to funerals will be different. And 6, I would like going to Greek restaurants. And I think maybe, is that it? Oh, a couple more slides. This is Brandy Bishop, who's white, imagining herself as an African-American princess, and she's drawn a castle in the back, and I love the little tiny figure with his face to the tree there. And then finally, one of the kids started this trend of thinking of themselves as embracing more than one race. And now as I said, it's a project actually that the teachers in training do at the University of North Carolina that has a big teacher training course. So it's interesting. It wasn't my intention in the beginning that other people do these things that I did, but it kept happening. And so I started thinking of my work also as a kind of model making, that I made it for myself as an artist, but then other people used it in other ways, and that's been gratifying as well. So I think that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks very much. Are there any questions? There's one immediately here.
Yeah.
Paul?
I'm just curious about what your thoughts are about the impact of the digital age on your process, because it seems to me that so much of the work is about the sort of tangibility of the material, and particularly the Kentucky images, where there's something about the inadequacy of the material that renders the subject in a particular way that somehow creates a kind of psychological space that the image is working perfectly. And it's inevitable, I think, that the materials that you're using will be superseded by digital technology. And I just wonder how that might impact really on your process.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a huge question. I really don't know. I mean, there have been changes along the way. Like it was hard for me when we lost those Instamatic cameras and that 126 film, moving to 35, you know, and you had all the space on the side, and it did have a very different feeling to it. Fortunately, Polaroid asked me to go to Mexico, and I had to use positive negative film. Now that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, not even to mention digital. And I really don't know. You know, it's something I talk about all the time. There's also the darkroom space for the kids socially. That's a huge thing. You know, because they relate to each other in that space in a way that they're not allowed to outside where people can see them. It's a mysterious place, and it's just not the same, you know, when you just have these images and you can't see where the emotion is, you can't scratch it off. I don't know. I think I'm going to have to, maybe I'll stop. I don't know. Yeah.
Martin, down the front, please.
I'd like to know a bit more about the selection process, because it appears to me, you know, you have a very refined aesthetic, and most of the images you select fit into that. Do you select for them, or do you encourage a collaborative process in the selection? Do you impose your values on the kids?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big topic. As far as selecting goes, you know, it's different in different situations. It depends on the time I have. When I was working in Kentucky, I was working with them for 5 years, and so I was able to really, when we did the book Portraits and Dreams, I had a designer come in to teach them about design, and I had an editor come in and teach them about editing. And so we did that stuff together. We chose how it was going to be structured, and they knew about books, and we studied the history of books, and so in a way that was the most collaborative I was able to do. In some of the other projects, when like in Margate, for example, the asylum-seeking kids many of them were only there for 2 weeks, and I had no idea at what point, neither did they, that they were going to leave. So that wasn't really possible. In the case of some of them, it was that I got to go see them again. But as far as the aesthetic goes, I really believe that we all have a sense of composition, and that my job when I'm working with them is to try to understand how they're seeing, what are their limitations and frustrations, and help them with that. But I think if they're encouraged to make images in the way that means most to them, the images are going to be better. But there's some kids like Denise who are just, have a kind of photographic vision, eventually I think she lost it, but when she reached puberty. But yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's that she was a child prodigy, and she would have had to go, she would have had to become conscious of what she was doing and to push it forward. And there wasn't really anything in her culture that would encourage her, other than me being there, that would encourage her to do that. But what's interesting, when I've started to hear from some of those kids, is that the ones I've heard from, they are taking pictures. But they're doing it, like Willie is a park ranger, and he's photographing the animals in the park. And another woman I've heard from is a educator, and she's teaching her kids how to make pictures. But it's not to be a photographer.
asked this question many times before. You've probably been asked this question many times before. Who actually owns the picture?
Well, I have copyright, and it's something that you know, I lay out before. I've become more conscious of this obviously as time goes on, and if there's any money made from any pictures, then a portion of it goes back to the situation that I'm working out of, whether it's like in Mexico, for instance, the devil spying on the girls was, well, some of those pictures were in the Whitney Biennial, and that one was used in the portfolio that year, and so there was enough money from that all the kids could buy 35 millimeters. So I always set that up. If a gallery sells some pictures, then they have to send money to
It's not me.
I'll wait for the music to stop. Hi. Quite a simplistic question, really. I'm intrigued by the Margate project, having spent probably my first 10 years summer vacations in Margate and, well, more particularly Westbrook, which is the next bay along. So to see that kind of decline is interesting, but moreover, what brought you to Margate?
Well, I was actually commissioned by Art Angel, which does public art projects, and it's an extended project. Mine was